I want you to hear this.
How could you do this to me?
I think the real question is, how could you do this to him?
I love you, not my husband, I promise.
My name is Damon Foster, and for 15 years I believed I was living the American dream. Turns out, I was just the supporting actor in someone else's nightmare. Let me paint you a picture of suburban Texas perfection. 3-bedroom house with a white picket fence, manicured lawn that I mowed every Saturday, and a garage filled with tools I actually knew how to use. My wife Rachel worked in marketing for Henderson & Associates, one of those firms that charged Fortune 500 companies ridiculous fees to tell them what their customers already knew. I ran a tech consulting business from home, fixing other people's digital disasters while wearing pajama pants and drinking coffee that could strip paint. Our daughter Ellie was 10, sharp as a tack, and had this way of looking at adults like she could see right through their lies. She spent most afternoons helping me troubleshoot network problems, asking questions that made me realize she understood more about people than I did about technology. "Dad, why does Mom always check her phone when she thinks we're not looking?" Ellie asked one Tuesday afternoon, her small fingers dancing across my laptop keyboard as she helped me test a client's security system. "Adults get a lot of work messages, sweetheart," I said, though I'd been wondering the same thing myself. Rachel had been different lately, not just distant. We'd been married long enough for me to recognize the natural ebb and flow of intimacy. This was something else. She'd developed this habit of taking calls in the bathroom, claimed she needed privacy for sensitive client discussions. She'd started buying new clothes, expensive stuff that she wore to work, but never around the house. Most telling of all, she'd begun treating me like furniture, present, functional, but not worth noticing. The first real clue came on a Thursday night in March. Rachel was at another client dinner, and I was helping Ellie with her math homework when I decided to grab a beer and unwind at Murphy's, the local dive bar where everyone knew your name and nobody judged your problems. Murphy's was the kind of place where the peanut shells on the floor were part of the ambiance, and the bartender, Jake, had been listening to the neighborhood's troubles since before I moved to town. The lighting was dim enough to hide the wear on the furniture, but bright enough to read the sports scores on the ancient television mounted in the corner. I was nursing my second beer when I heard a familiar laugh from the corner booth. Rachel's laugh, the one she used when she wanted something from someone. I turned slightly and saw her sitting across from a man I recognized from her company Christmas parties. Eric Latham, Rick to his friends, regional sales director, divorced, and the kind of guy who wore cologne like armor. They weren't discussing quarterly projections. Rachel was leaning forward, her hand resting on his arm, her voice low and intimate. Rick was grinning like he'd won the lottery, occasionally glancing around to make sure nobody was watching. They were wrong about that last part. "Another beer, Damon?" Jake asked, following my gaze. "Or something stronger?" "Just the beer," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And maybe some perspective." Jake had been tending bar long enough to read situations. Sometimes perspective comes with a price tag. I watched them for another 20 minutes. Rachel touched his hand. Rick whispered something that made her giggle like a teenager. When they finally left, separately, 5 minutes apart, I sat there staring at my empty bottle and wondering how long this had been going on. The next morning, Rachel was humming in the shower. She never hummed in the shower. "You're in a good mood," I said when she emerged, wrapped in the terry cloth robe I'd bought her for Christmas. "The Peterson account is finally coming together," she said, not meeting my eyes. "We celebrated last night." "With the whole team?" "Just a few of us. Rick was there. You remember Rick from the Christmas party. He's been instrumental in closing this deal." I'll bet he has, I thought. But what I said was, "That's great, honey. I'm proud of you." She smiled then, the same smile she'd given Rick the night before, and I realized something that made my stomach turn. She thought I was stupid. Not just oblivious, actually stupid. The kind of husband who would swallow any story, believe any excuse, and never ask the right questions. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Rachel's late meetings always seemed to coincide with Rick's schedule. Her phone was never more than arm's reach away, and she'd developed a nervous habit of flipping it face down whenever I walked into the room. She'd started mentioning Rick more often in casual conversation, the way people do when they're trying to normalize something abnormal. "Rick thinks we should invest in that new software platform," she'd say over dinner. "Rick mentioned this great restaurant downtown," she'd add while planning our anniversary. "Rick says the housing market is about to shift," she'd announce while reviewing our mortgage statements. Rick. The man was becoming a third member of our household, and I was apparently the only one who found that strange. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in April. I was cleaning out Rachel's car. She'd asked me to take it for an oil change, when I found a hotel receipt wedged between the passenger seat and center console. The Marriott Downtown, King Suite, 2 nights the previous week. The same week, Rachel had supposedly been at a conference in Austin. I sat in the driver's seat, rain drumming on the roof, staring at that receipt like it might spontaneously combust. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand explanations and apologies and promises that things would change. But a larger part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since that night at Murphy's, wanted something else entirely. I wanted to watch her world collapse the same way mine had. That evening, Rachel announced she had another company event coming up. "It's the quarterly celebration," she said, not looking up from her laptop. "Fancy dinner, awards ceremony, the whole production. Rick will be there with some of the other regional directors." "Sounds like fun," I said. "Should I dust off my good suit?" She looked up then, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Panic? Annoyance? "Actually, it might be awkward. Rick's ex-wife might be there, and you know how complicated those situations can get. Plus, I'll be networking with senior management most of the night. You'd probably be bored." "If you think that's best," I said, and her relief was almost palpable. "I do. Besides, someone should stay home with Ellie." That night, after Rachel had gone to bed, I sat in my home office and made some phone calls. The tech consulting business had taught me that information was the most valuable currency in the world, and I'd been saving up for 15 years. By morning, I had what I needed. A phone call to an old college friend who now worked in corporate recruitment, a few professional references, and a resume that highlighted skills I'd been developing while Rachel thought I was just fixing computers in my pajamas. Henderson and Associates was about to get a new regional technology director. They just didn't know it yet. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror while shaving, and for the first time in months, I smiled. Not the polite husband smile I'd been wearing like a mask, but something sharper, something with teeth. "Rachel," I called out as she rushed around getting ready for work. "What's the date of that company party again?" "Next Friday," she said, checking her phone. "Why?" "Just curious. Have a great day at work, honey." She kissed me on the cheek, a quick, distracted peck that felt more like a business transaction than affection, and headed out the door. I watched her drive away, then picked up my phone and dialed Henderson and Associates. "This is Damon Foster," I told the receptionist. "I believe Mr. Henderson is expecting my call." The grand ballroom at the Marriott downtown was the kind of place that screamed corporate success with all the subtlety of a foghorn. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted to look like heaven. Round tables draped in white linen dotted the polished marble floor, and a small army of servers in black ties moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and appetizers that cost more per piece than most people spent on lunch. I adjusted my new tie, silk, expensive, purchased specifically for this occasion, and surveyed the room from the entrance. Rachel was easy to spot. She'd worn the red dress I'd complimented her on last Christmas, back when I thought she'd bought it for me. She was standing near the bar with Rick, both of them laughing at something on her phone. Rick had his hand on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that would have sent me into a rage 3 weeks ago. Tonight, it just made me smile. Damon Foster? The voice belonged to Margaret Henderson, CEO of Henderson & Associates, and the woman who'd hired me after a single phone interview. She was in her 60s, silver-haired, and had the kind of presence that made boardrooms go quiet when she entered. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight. Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Henderson. I'm looking forward to working with the team. Please call me Margaret, and I think you'll find our team very interesting." She glanced across the room toward Rachel and Rick, and something in her expression told me she knew exactly why I'd taken this job. "Shall we make the rounds? I'd like to introduce you to some key people before the presentations begin." We moved through the crowd, Margaret making introductions while I shook hands and made small talk with department heads, project managers, and regional directors. I could feel eyes on me, curious glances from people who recognized me from company Christmas parties and summer picnics, confused looks from those trying to figure out how Rachel Foster's husband had suddenly become their new boss. Rachel hadn't seen me yet. She was too busy whispering with Rick near the silent auction table, probably planning their next hotel rendezvous. Rick was wearing a suit that cost more than my car payment, his hair slicked back with enough product to waterproof a deck. He had that particular brand of confidence that came from believing you were untouchable. "Damon?" The voice belonged to Patricia Denby, Rachel's direct supervisor, and a woman who'd never liked my wife's tendency to take credit for other people's work. "What are you doing here?" "Hello, Patricia. Margaret invited me. I'm starting Monday as Regional Technology Director." Patricia's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. "Regional Technology Director? That's a senior position." "Yes, it is." I smiled. "I'm looking forward to working with your department. I understand Rachel will be reporting to me on the Peterson account integration." The color drained from Patricia's face as the implications sank in. "Rachel reports to you?" "Among others." Margaret felt my background in systems integration would be valuable for the upcoming digital transformation project. Across the room, someone tapped a microphone, sending feedback squealing through the ballroom. Margaret Henderson stepped up to the small stage that had been set up near the windows. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The crowd began to quiet, conversations trailing off as people turned toward the stage. Rachel and Rick were still deep in conversation near the bar, oblivious to what was coming. "Tonight we celebrate another successful quarter, but more importantly, we look toward the future," Margaret began. "Henderson & Associates has always prided itself on innovation, on staying ahead of the curve in an increasingly digital marketplace." I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned to see Jake Morrison, one of the junior account managers. "Damon? What are you doing here, man?" "Working," I said simply. "To that end," Margaret continued, "I'm pleased to announce that we've brought in new leadership for our technology division. Please join me in welcoming our new Regional Technology Director, Damon Foster." The applause was polite but confused. Most of the room knew me as Rachel's husband, the guy who fixed their home computers and showed up to company picnics with potato salad. Now I was walking toward the stage, adjusting my tie, and accepting a microphone from the CEO. I found Rachel in the crowd. She was frozen, champagne glass halfway to her lips, staring at me like I'd just materialized from thin air. Rick looked like he'd swallowed his tongue. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. "I'm excited to join the Henderson & Associates family in an official capacity. Many of you know me already. I've been consulting on various projects for the past few years, usually behind the scenes." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were putting pieces together, remembering times when their technical problems had been mysteriously solved, when system upgrades had gone smoother than expected, when someone had quietly fixed issues that could have cost the company thousands of dollars. Over the next few months, we'll be implementing a comprehensive digital transformation that will streamline operations, improve client communication, and eliminate redundancies in our current systems. I paused, letting my eyes find Rachel again. "I'm particularly looking forward to working with the marketing department to optimize their client management processes." Rachel set down her champagne glass with shaking hands. Rick was whispering something urgent in her ear, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, fear mixed with something that might have been respect. I believe in transparency, I continued, warming to the theme. In my experience, the biggest problems in any organization come from poor communication and misplaced trust. People working at cross purposes, pursuing personal agendas instead of company goals, thinking they can operate in shadows without consequences. The room was completely quiet now. Patricia Denby was smiling. Margaret Henderson was nodding approvingly. Rachel looked like she might throw up. But enough about philosophy, I said, stepping back from the microphone. Let's celebrate the success we've all worked so hard to achieve. The applause was louder this time, more genuine. As I made my way down from the stage, people approached to shake my hand, to welcome me to the team, to ask questions about the upcoming changes. I answered politely, professionally, all while keeping track of Rachel and Rick through my peripheral vision. They were having what looked like an urgent conversation near the emergency exit. Rick kept gesturing toward me, his face flushed with anger or panic. Rachel was shaking her head, her hands moving in quick, nervous gestures. "Excuse me," I told the group of project managers who'd been asking about software upgrades. "I should go say hello to my wife." I made my way across the room, stopping to chat briefly with colleagues, accepting congratulations, playing the role of the gracious new executive. By the time I reached Rachel and Rick, they'd managed to compose themselves, at least on the surface. "Surprise," I said, leaning in to kiss Rachel's cheek. She smelled like expensive perfume and desperation. "Damon," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea you were... How did you..." "Margaret called last week. Apparently, my work on the Morrison account impressed some people." I turned to Rick, extending my hand. "Rick, good to see you again. I'm looking forward to working together." Rick's handshake was clammy, his smile forced. "Congratulations, Damon. This is quite a surprise." "The best kind," I agreed. "Rachel, you look beautiful tonight." "That dress is stunning." She touched the fabric self-consciously. "Thank you. I can't believe you didn't tell me about the job. I wanted it to be a surprise. Plus, you've been so busy with your own projects lately, I didn't want to distract you." I smiled at Rick. "I understand you've been instrumental in helping Rachel with the Peterson account." Rick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just doing my job." "I'm sure you are. Margaret mentioned that account specifically when she offered me the position. Apparently, there have been some concerns about project management and resource allocation." Rachel's face went pale. "Concerns?" "Nothing major," I said casually. "Just some irregularities in expense reporting and time tracking. I'm sure it's just a matter of better oversight." The music started up again, a jazz quartet that had been hired to provide sophisticated background ambiance. Couples began moving toward the small dance floor that had been set up near the stage. "Would you like to dance?" I asked Rachel. She looked trapped, glancing between Rick and me like a deer caught between two sets of headlights. Yes. Of course." I led her onto the dance floor, placing one hand on her waist and taking her hand with the other. She felt tense, brittle, like she might shatter if I held her too tightly. "You're full of surprises tonight," she said as we began to move to the music. "I'm full of surprises every night. You just haven't been paying attention." We danced in silence for a moment, surrounded by other couples, the chandeliers casting prismatic light across the polished floor. From the corner of my eye, I could see Rick standing alone near the bar, watching us with undisguised hostility. "Damon," Rachel said finally, "about the Peterson account." "What about it?" "Some of the expenses. Rick and I have been working long hours, and sometimes we've had to meet off-site, and..." "Rachel." I spun her gently, bringing her back into my arms. "Are you trying to tell me something?" She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd married 15 years ago, vulnerable, uncertain, human. Then the mask slipped back into place. "No," she said. Nothing important. The song ended, and I escorted her back to where Rick was waiting. He'd ordered another drink, something dark and strong that he was gripping like a lifeline. I should mingle, I announced. Margaret wants me to meet the other department heads before the evening ends. Of course, Rachel said. I'll see you at home. Actually, I said, as if the thought had just occurred to me, why don't you ride home with me? We can celebrate my new position properly. Rachel glanced at Rick, a quick, panicked look. I came with Lila. I should probably ride back with her. Lila's already left, I said. I saw her heading out about 20 minutes ago. Something about a babysitter emergency. This was a lie, but Rachel didn't know that. She was trapped, and we all knew it. I can give Rachel a ride, Rick offered, his voice tight with forced casualness. I turned to him with a smile that had nothing warm in it. That's very generous, Rick, but I wouldn't want to put you out. Besides, I'm sure your wife is expecting you home. Rick flinched like I'd slapped him. His wife, Vanessa, had moved to Dallas 6 months ago, but she hadn't filed for divorce yet. Technically, he was still a married man having an affair with my wife. Right, he said. Of course. I offered Rachel my arm. Shall we go, darling? She had no choice but to take it. As we walked toward the exit, I could feel Rick's eyes on us, could sense his frustration and growing panic. Good. Let him sweat. In the elevator down to the parking garage, Rachel was quiet, staring at the numbers as they descended. Finally, as we reached the ground floor, she spoke. How long have you known? I looked at her reflection in the polished steel doors. Known what? The doors opened, and we stepped out into the concrete cavern of the parking garage. Our footsteps echoed off the walls as we walked toward my car. About Rick and me, she said quietly. I stopped walking and turned to face her. What about you and Rick? She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for some clue about what I was thinking. Finally, she shook her head. Nothing, she said. Never mind. I opened the passenger door for her, the perfect gentleman. Get in, Rachel. We're going home. As I walked around to the driver's side, I caught sight of my reflection in the car window. I was smiling again, that sharp, predatory smile that was becoming more familiar every day. The game was just beginning. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp April sunshine that made everything look possible. I put on my best suit, navy blue, recently tailored, with a tie that Rachel had never seen, and drove to the Henderson and Associates building for my first official day as Regional Technology Director. The office was a glass and steel monument to corporate ambition, 23 floors of polished surfaces and carefully controlled climate. My new office was on the 15th floor with a view of downtown Dallas and a door that locked from the inside. More importantly, it came with access to the company's internal systems, email servers, and personnel files. I spent the morning in meetings with Margaret Henderson and the other department heads, reviewing budgets and timelines for the digital transformation project. Everyone was professional, welcoming, eager to work with someone who actually understood technology instead of just talking about it in buzzwords and quarterly projections. Rachel worked on the 12th floor. I could have taken the elevator down to see her, could have stopped by her cubicle to say hello, to play the role of the loving husband checking in on his wife's first day working under his supervision. Instead, I opened my laptop and began to work. The Peterson account files made for interesting reading. Rachel and Rick had indeed been working closely together, very closely. Their email correspondence was professional on the surface, but reading between the lines revealed a pattern of private meetings, extended lunches, and overnight trips that didn't quite align with project requirements. More interesting were the expense reports. Hotel rooms booked for client meetings that lasted longer than necessary. Dinners for two at restaurants where the Peterson account contacts lived in different cities. Car rentals and gas receipts that suggested trips to locations that had nothing to do with business. I printed everything, organized it into neat folders, and locked them in my desk drawer. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia Denby. Patricia, it's Damon Foster. Do you have a few minutes to discuss the Peterson account transition? Of course. Should I come up to your office? Actually, let's meet in conference room C. I'd like to review some documents with you. 20 minutes later, Patricia and I were seated at the polished conference table, spreadsheets and expense reports arranged between us like evidence at a trial. These numbers seem high, I said, pointing to a series of hotel charges, especially for a project this size. Patricia frowned, adjusting her reading glasses. I've been concerned about that myself. Rachel assured me that the client required extensive on-site consultation, but when I spoke to Mr. Peterson directly, he seemed surprised by the frequency of visits. You spoke to the client directly? Last week. He mentioned that he'd only met with Rachel twice, both times in his office here in Dallas. He was confused about why we were billing for so many travel expenses. I made a note on my legal pad. What did Rachel say when you asked her about the discrepancy? She said there must have been a miscommunication, that she'd been meeting with other stakeholders in the Peterson organization. But when I asked for their contact information, Patricia shrugged. She said she'd get back to me, but she never did. I see. I gathered the documents into a neat stack. I think we need to have a team meeting about project accountability and expense management. When were you thinking? I checked my calendar, though I already knew what I was going to say. How about this afternoon? Say 3 o'clock? I'd like Rachel and Rick to present a detailed breakdown of their activities on the Peterson account. Patricia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I'll send out the meeting invitations. After Patricia left, I sat alone in the conference room, looking out at the Dallas skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere in this building, Rachel was probably having a panic attack. Rick was likely trying to figure out how to spin 3 months of fabricated expenses into something that looked legitimate. They were about to learn that I'd been paying attention to more than just computer networks for the past 15 years. At 3 o'clock sharp, I walked into conference room A with a folder full of documents and a laptop loaded with presentation slides. Rachel was already there, sitting next to Rick, both of them looking like students called to the principal's office. Patricia sat across from them, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes bright with anticipation. Thank you all for coming, I said, connecting my laptop to the room's projection system. I wanted to review the Peterson account status and discuss some concerns that have been raised about project management. The first slide was a timeline of the project, with key milestones and deliverables clearly marked. The second slide showed budgeted versus actual expenses, with hotel and travel costs highlighted in red. As you can see, I said, using a laser pointer to highlight the discrepancies, we're significantly over budget on ancillary expenses. Rachel, can you walk us through the necessity for these additional costs? Rachel cleared her throat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The Peterson organization has a complex stakeholder structure. We've had to conduct extensive outreach to ensure buy-in from all decision-makers. I see. And these stakeholders are located in Austin, San Antonio, and Houston? Yes, that's correct. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of Texas with the cities marked. Interesting. According to the Peterson Company directory, their entire executive team is based here in Dallas, with a small satellite office in Fort Worth. The silence in the room was deafening. Rick shifted in his chair, his face flushing red above his expensive collar. Rachel stared at the projection screen like it might spontaneously combust. Perhaps there was a miscommunication, Rick said finally. We may have been meeting with potential partners or subsidiary contacts. That's possible, I agreed. Do you have contact information for these partners? Names, companies, meeting agendas? I'd like to follow up to ensure we're providing appropriate value for our fees. Another silence. Patricia was taking notes, her pen scratching across the legal pad with mechanical precision. I'll need to review my files, Rachel said weakly. Of course. Why don't you compile that information and have it to me by the end of the week? I clicked to the final slide, which showed revised budget projections and accountability measures. Going forward, all travel expenses over $50 will require pre-approval from department heads, and all client meetings will be documented with attendee lists and agenda summaries. Damon, Rick said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Don't you think that's a bit micromanaging? We're professionals here. I turned to look at him directly, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Rick, in my experience, professionals don't mind documentation. It protects everyone involved and ensures that clients receive the value they're paying for. Of course, he said, but his hands were clenched into fists on the conference table. Excellent. Patricia, can you work with Rachel and Rick to implement these new procedures? Absolutely. Then I think we're done here. Thank you all for your time. As the others filed out, Rachel lingered behind, pretending to organize her papers. When the door closed, leaving us alone, she finally looked up at me. You're enjoying this, she said. I'm doing my job. This isn't about the Peterson account, and we both know it. I closed my laptop and unplugged the cables, taking my time with each connection. Rachel, I'm not sure what you're implying, but if you have concerns about company policies, you should discuss them with Patricia. Company policies. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right. Is there something else you wanted to discuss? She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options. Confession, defiance, manipulation. She was considering all of them. No, she said finally. Nothing else. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room, watching the late afternoon sun paint geometric shadows across the polished table. Through the glass walls, I could see the normal rhythm of office life, people moving between cubicles, gathering around the coffee machine, preparing to head home to their families. My phone buzzed with a text message. Rachel, working late tonight. Don't wait up. I smiled and typed back, no problem, I have some work to catch up on myself. But I wasn't planning to work late. I had other plans for the evening, plans that involved a certain regional sales director and his overpriced BMW. Rick's car was easy to spot in the parking lot of Flanagan's, the upscale sports bar where Henderson and Associates employees often went to decompress after difficult days. The BMW was parked under a streetlight, its black paint gleaming like a beetle's shell. I parked 3 spaces away and waited. Through the bar's windows, I could see Rick at a corner table, drinking something amber-colored and staring at his phone. He looked like a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Good. At 9:30, Rick emerged from the bar, walking with the careful precision of someone who'd had just enough alcohol to feel invincible, but not enough to be obviously impaired. He fumbled with his key fob, and the BMW's lights flashed in response. I waited until he'd driven away, then got out of my car and walked over to where the BMW had been parked. Rick was a creature of habit. He'd be back tomorrow night, and the night after that, drowning his sorrows and plotting his next move. But tomorrow night he was going to find a surprise waiting for him. I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, past houses where families were settling in for the evening, where husbands and wives were sharing the details of their days, where children were being tucked into bed with stories and kisses. Rachel's car wasn't in our driveway. Of course it wasn't. Ellie was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, her homework spread across the coffee table. "Hey, Dad," she said without looking up. "How was your first day at Mom's work?" "Interesting," I said, settling into my favorite chair. "Very interesting." Mom called. She said she's working late again. That's what she told me too. Ellie looked up from her book, her 10-year-old eyes too knowing for comfort. "She's been working late a lot lately." "Yes, she has." "Dad?" "Yeah, sweetheart." "Are you and Mom okay?" I looked at my daughter, at her serious expression and worried eyes, and felt something twist in my chest. Whatever happened between Rachel and me, Ellie didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. We're figuring some things out, I said carefully. But no matter what happens, you know that both Mom and I love you very much, right? She nodded, but her expression didn't change. I know, I hope you figure it out soon. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. That night, after Ellie had gone to bed, I sat in my home office and made a list. Not a to-do list or a grocery list, but something more comprehensive. An inventory of everything Rachel and Rick had taken from me: trust, respect, 15 years of marriage, the security of my family. Then I made another list, this one detailing everything I planned to take from them. By the time I finished, it was past midnight and I was smiling again. Tuesday evening found me in the parking lot of Flanagan's again, but this time I wasn't alone. Jake Morrison, the junior account manager who'd seemed genuinely happy about my promotion, sat in the passenger seat of my car, holding a bag of supplies we'd purchased at 3 different stores. I can't believe we're doing this, Jake said, but he was grinning like a teenager about to toilet paper the principal's house. Think of it as team building, I replied, checking my watch. Rick's BMW was parked in its usual spot under the streetlight, and through the bar's windows, we could see him at his corner table, working on what appeared to be his 4th whiskey. What exactly did he do to you? Jake asked. I'd given Jake the sanitized version. Rick had been undermining my authority, spreading rumors about my qualifications, generally being the kind of corporate politician who made everyone's job harder. It was close enough to the truth that Jake's sense of workplace justice had been activated. Let's just say he needs to learn about consequences, I said, opening my car door. Keep watch. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. No permanent damage, nothing that couldn't be cleaned up with enough time and money, but definitely enough to make a point. I opened the valve on Rick's front tire and listened to the satisfying hiss of escaping air. Then I moved to the rear tire and repeated the process. Jake was keeping watch, occasionally giving me a thumbs up when the coast was clear. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few other cars belonging to die-hard drinkers and restaurant staff finishing their shifts. For the piece de résistance, I pulled out a small tube of industrial adhesive and carefully applied it to the BMW's door handles. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but definitely enough to require professional removal. Time to go, I whispered to Jake, and we walked casually back to my car. We were pulling out of the parking lot when Rick emerged from the bar. Through my rearview mirror, I watched him approach his car, key fob in hand. He pressed the button, and the BMW's lights flashed in response, but when he tried to open the driver's door, his hand stuck to the handle. Jake burst into laughter. Did you see his face? I had indeed seen Rick's face, and it was everything I'd hoped for. Confusion, followed by anger, followed by the dawning realization that someone had deliberately targeted him. Phase 1 complete, I said, turning toward home. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and made myself visible. I attended a breakfast meeting with Margaret Henderson, reviewed quarterly projections with the finance team, and made sure at least a dozen people could verify my whereabouts during the previous evening. Rick didn't show up until almost noon, looking rumpled and furious. Word spread quickly through the office grapevine. His car had been vandalized, he'd had to call a tow truck, and he'd spent 3 hours at a 24-hour detail shop getting the adhesive removed from his door handles. Teenagers, Patricia Denby said when she stopped by my office to discuss the morning's developments. Probably the same ones who've been spray painting the overpass. Probably, I agreed, not looking up from my computer screen. Rick seemed pretty upset about it. Well, it's a nice car. Expensive. Yes, it is. That afternoon, I implemented Phase 2 of my plan. I'd spent the previous evening researching Rick's professional history, and what I'd found was illuminating. 3 jobs in 5 years, each departure preceded by rumors of inappropriate relationships with colleagues. A pattern of behavior that suggested Rick Latham was exactly the kind of man who viewed workplace ethics as suggestions rather than requirements. I printed out the relevant information, public records, LinkedIn profiles, professional references, and compiled it into a neat folder. Then I scheduled a meeting with Margaret Henderson. I wanted to discuss some concerns about the Peterson account, I told her, closing her office door behind me. Margaret looked up from her computer, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. What kind of concerns? I handed her the folder. I've been reviewing Rick Latham's professional background, and I found some patterns that might be relevant to his current performance. Margaret opened the folder and began reading, her expression growing more serious with each page. These are significant allegations. They're not allegations, I said carefully. They're documented facts. Employment dates, reasons for departure, professional references who declined to provide recommendations. And you think this relates to the Peterson account how? I pulled out the expense reports we'd discussed in the previous day's meeting. The pattern of behavior suggests someone who has difficulty maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. The expense discrepancies we identified yesterday might be symptoms of a larger problem. Margaret studied the documents for several minutes, occasionally making notes in the margins. Finally, she looked up at me. What are you recommending? Closer supervision of the Peterson account, mandatory documentation of all client interactions, and perhaps a review of other projects Rick has managed recently. I'll speak with Patricia about implementing additional oversight, Margaret said. And Damon? Good catch. This is exactly the kind of proactive management we need. I left Margaret's office feeling satisfied but not complete. Rick's professional reputation was now under scrutiny. His expensive car had been humiliated in a public parking lot, and his affair with Rachel was becoming increasingly risky as workplace policies tightened around them. But I wasn't finished yet. That evening, I drove to Rick's apartment complex, a trendy development called the Metropolitan that catered to young professionals and recently divorced middle-aged men trying to recapture their youth. Rick lived in a corner unit on the 3rd floor, with a balcony that overlooked the complex's swimming pool and fitness center. I didn't plan to break in or do anything illegal. I just wanted to observe, to understand his routines and vulnerabilities. Knowledge was power, and I'd been accumulating both for weeks. At 8:30, Rachel's car pulled into the visitor parking area. I watched from across the street as she got out of her sedan, looked around nervously, and walked toward the building entrance. She was carrying a bottle of wine and what looked like takeout bags from an expensive restaurant downtown. They thought they were being careful, meeting at his place instead of hotels, using cash for dinners, keeping their phones on silent during their romantic interludes. But careful wasn't the same as invisible, and I'd been watching for long enough to map their entire relationship. Rachel stayed for 2 hours. When she emerged from the building, her hair was mussed and her lipstick was gone, but she looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen at home in months. She drove away, without noticing my car parked in the shadows across the street. I waited another 30 minutes, then drove home to find Ellie asleep on the couch, her homework scattered across the coffee table, and a note from Rachel explaining that she'd be working late again. The note was written on our good stationery, the kind Rachel usually reserved for thank you cards and formal correspondence. Even her lies were getting more elaborate. I carried Ellie upstairs to her bedroom, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead. She stirred slightly but didn't wake up, and I stood in her doorway for a moment, listening to her steady breathing and wondering how I was going to explain the next few weeks to her. Then I went downstairs to my home office and began planning Phase 3. Rick's professional reputation was damaged but not destroyed. His car had been inconvenienced but not ruined. His affair with Rachel was risky but still secret. It was time to change that last part. I opened my laptop and began typing an email. Not to Rick or Rachel, that would be too obvious, too easily traced back to me. Instead, I composed a message to someone who had every right to know what her husband was doing during his evenings out. Vanessa Latham had moved to Dallas 6 months ago to try to save her marriage. She'd found a job, rented an apartment, and according to her Facebook page was working on rebuilding trust and communication. She seemed like a nice woman, certainly too nice for Rick. The email was anonymous, sent from a disposable account I'd created specifically for this purpose. It contained dates, times, and locations where Rick and Rachel had been seen together. No photos, I wasn't a stalker, but enough specific information to make it clear that this wasn't a random accusation. I included Rick's address, Rachel's license plate number, and a suggestion that Vanessa might want to verify the information herself. Then I hit send and closed the laptop. Phase 3 was now in motion, and unlike the previous phases, this one didn't depend on my direct involvement. Vanessa Latham would either investigate the claims or ignore them, but either way, the information was now out in the world, creating possibilities I couldn't control. That was the beauty of it. The best revenge wasn't something you did to someone. It was something you let them do to themselves. I went upstairs, brushed my teeth, and got into bed. Rachel's side was cold and empty, the sheets still tucked in from that morning. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, and waited for tomorrow. Somewhere across town, Vanessa Latham was reading an email that would change her life. Somewhere else, Rick was probably pouring himself another drink and congratulating himself on how cleverly he'd managed his double life. And somewhere in between, Rachel was driving home through the quiet suburban streets, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse around her. I smiled in the darkness and closed my eyes. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of gray, overcast sky that made everything look like a noir film. I was in my office by 7:30, reviewing quarterly reports and pretending to be surprised when Patricia Denby knocked on my door at 8:15. "We have a situation," she said, closing the door behind her and taking a seat across from my desk. "What kind of situation?" "Rick Latham's wife showed up in the lobby 20 minutes ago, demanding to see him. Security called me because she seemed agitated." I set down my coffee cup and tried to look concerned rather than delighted. "Agitated how?" "She was asking questions about his work schedule, wanting to know if he'd really been working late on the Peterson account. When security told her Rick wasn't in yet, she asked for a list of his recent business trips. That's unusual. It gets worse. She mentioned something about anonymous tips and surveillance. I think someone's been feeding her information about Rick's activities." I frowned thoughtfully, the picture of professional concern. "Do we know who?" "No idea. But Damon, if there's some kind of personal drama brewing, it could affect the Peterson account. We can't have clients witnessing domestic disputes in our offices." "Absolutely not. Where is Mrs. Latham now?" "I convinced her to wait in conference room B until Rick arrives. She seemed willing to keep this private, at least for now." I checked my watch. Rick usually arrived around 9, which gave us 40 minutes to prepare for what promised to be an explosive confrontation. "I'll handle this," I told Patricia. "Can you make sure the Peterson account files are secured? If this gets messy, we don't want sensitive client information caught in the crossfire." Patricia nodded and left, and I sat back in my chair, feeling the familiar rush of a plan coming together perfectly. I hadn't expected Vanessa to move this quickly, but her efficiency was working in my favor. At 8:50, I positioned myself near the elevator bank, ostensibly reviewing emails on my phone, but actually watching for Rick's arrival. He stepped out of the elevator at 8:53, looking like he'd slept poorly and dressed in a hurry. "Rick," I called out, walking over to intercept him. "Do you have a minute? There's something we need to discuss." He looked wary, but nodded. "What's going on?" "Your wife is here." The color drained from Rick's face. "What?" "She's been asking questions about your work schedule, business trips, things like that. Patricia's keeping her in conference room B, but I thought you should know before you run into her unexpectedly." Rick's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone. "I need to call her, explain—" "Rick!" I put a hand on his shoulder, the gesture of a concerned colleague. "Is there something going on that might affect your work performance? Because if there is, we need to address it before it becomes a bigger problem." He stared at me, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much trouble he was in. "It's just marital stuff," he said finally. We've been having problems since she moved here. She's paranoid, suspicious. I see. Well, maybe you should go talk to her, clear things up. Rick nodded and headed toward the conference rooms, his shoulders hunched like a man walking to his execution. I gave him a 5-minute head start, then followed at a discreet distance. Conference room B had glass walls, which meant anyone walking past could see inside. I made sure to walk past several times over the next 30 minutes, each time catching glimpses of what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion. Vanessa Latham was a small woman with dark hair and the kind of precise, controlled movements that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. She had a folder of documents spread across the conference table and was pointing to specific items while Rick shook his head and gestured defensively. The conversation was clearly not going well for Rick. At 9:30, Vanessa emerged from the conference room alone, her face flushed but her composure intact. She walked directly to the elevator without looking back, and I heard Rick calling her name from the conference room doorway. She didn't stop. Rick stood in the hallway for a moment, running his hands through his hair, then noticed me watching from my office doorway. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said, but his voice was hoarse and his tie was askew. "Just fine." He disappeared into his own office and closed the door. Through the glass walls, I could see him on the phone, probably trying to call Vanessa back. From his increasingly frantic gestures, the calls weren't being answered. I spent the rest of the morning in meetings, but the office grapevine kept me updated on Rick's deteriorating situation. He'd made at least 20 phone calls, had been seen crying in the men's room, and had snapped at 2 different colleagues who'd tried to ask him questions about ongoing projects. At lunch, I drove to a sandwich shop near Rick's apartment complex, and wasn't surprised to see a moving truck parked outside the Metropolitan. Vanessa was apparently wasting no time in extracting herself from her marriage. When I returned to the office, Margaret Henderson was waiting in my office. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "About Rick? About Rick, about the Peterson account, and about some very disturbing information that's come to my attention." She handed me a manila envelope. Inside were printouts of emails, expense reports, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of Rick's activities over the past 3 months. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "Rick's wife dropped them off this morning after her meeting with him. She said she'd been investigating his behavior and thought we should know what kind of employee we had on our payroll." I studied the documents. They were thorough, professionally organized, and absolutely damning. Vanessa had documented every hotel charge, every unexplained absence, every expense that didn't align with legitimate business activities. "This is quite comprehensive," I said. "She used to be an accountant before she moved here. Apparently, she's very good at following paper trails." Margaret pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm. She also hired professionals to verify her suspicions. They have photographs, credit card records, even GPS tracking data from Rick's phone. I looked up at Margaret. "GPS tracking?" Apparently, she installed monitoring software on his phone months ago, back when she first suspected he was cheating. She has a complete record of everywhere he's been, everyone he's called, every text message he's sent. This was even better than I'd hoped. Vanessa hadn't just discovered Rick's affair. She'd documented it with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want Rick Latham gone," Margaret said flatly. "Today. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and the liability exposure is enormous. If Rachel Foster is involved in this situation, I want her gone too." "Rachel is involved," I said carefully. "The GPS data and photographs make that clear." Margaret nodded grimly. "Then they're both terminated. I'll have HR prepare the paperwork, and I want security to escort them out of the building before the end of the day." "What about the Peterson account?" "You'll take it over directly. I have complete confidence in your ability to manage the client relationship and clean up whatever mess they've made." After Margaret left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the Dallas skyline and feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. In less than a week, I'd gone from being the oblivious husband to being the architect of my wife's professional destruction. But I wasn't finished yet. At 3 o'clock, I watched through my office window as security guards escorted Rick to his desk, supervised him while he packed his personal belongings, and then walked him to the elevator. He looked broken, defeated, like a man who'd lost everything in a single morning, which of course he had. Rachel's termination was scheduled for 4 o'clock, but she never made it that long. At 3:30, she knocked on my office door, her face pale and her hands shaking. "We need to talk," she said. "About what?" She closed the door and sat down across from my desk. "About Rick, about the Peterson account, about what's happening here." "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't." Her voice was sharp, desperate. "Don't pretend you don't know what's going on. Rick's wife had documentation, photographs, evidence of things that should have been private." "That sounds like a problem between Rick and his wife." "She had my license plate number, Damon. She knew where I lived, where I worked, what kind of car I drove. That information didn't come from casual observation." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that someone's been watching us, following us, documenting our activities. And I'm suggesting that someone has access to company systems, employee records, and the kind of resources that would make this level of surveillance possible." "That's a serious accusation, Rachel." "Is it an accusation or a statement of fact?" We stared at each other across my desk, and I could see her putting the pieces together. The timing of my job offer, my presence at the company party, my sudden interest in the Peterson account, it was all too convenient to be coincidental. "You planned this," she said quietly. "All of it. I planned to do my job professionally and ethically. If that created problems for people who weren't behaving professionally and ethically, then those are natural consequences, not planned outcomes." Rachel's laugh was bitter, desperate. "Natural consequences. Right. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss about the Peterson account? Because if not, I have work to do." She stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This isn't over, Damon." "Actually," I said, picking up my phone, "I think it is." I dialed Margaret Henderson's extension. "Margaret?" "Yes, Rachel's here now." "Should I send her down to HR?" Rachel's face went white as she realized what was happening. "Of course," I continued into the phone. "I'll make sure she gets there safely." I hung up and looked at Rachel. "HR is expecting you. Something about termination paperwork and final paycheck processing." For a moment, I thought she might cry. Then I thought she might scream. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door. "You think you've won," she said without turning around. "I think I've done what needed to be done." She left without another word, and 20 minutes later, I watched from my window as security escorted her to the parking garage. She walked with her head high, maintaining her dignity even in defeat, and I felt a brief flash of something that might have been admiration. Then I remembered the hotel receipts, the lies, the casual way she'd dismissed me as too stupid to notice her betrayal, and the feeling passed. I stayed in the office until 7, tying up loose ends and preparing to take over the Peterson account. When I finally drove home, the house was dark except for the porch light and Ellie's bedroom window. I found my daughter in the kitchen, eating cereal for dinner and working on homework. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, loosening my tie. "Where's Mom?" "She came home around 5, packed a suitcase and left," Ellie said matter-of-factly. "She said she was going to stay with Aunt Linda for a few days." Rachel's sister lived in Houston, 3 hours away, far enough to avoid immediate confrontation, close enough to plan her next move. "Did she say anything else?" Ellie looked up from her math worksheet. "She said you'd explain everything." I sat down across from her at the kitchen table, looking at my 10-year-old daughter's serious face, and wondered how to explain that sometimes adults made choices that hurt the people they were supposed to love most. "Mom and I are having some problems," I said finally. "We're going to need some time to figure things out." "Are you getting divorced?" The question was direct, practical, delivered without emotion. Ellie had always been mature for her age, but this level of acceptance seemed beyond her years. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Would that scare you?" She considered this for a moment, chewing thoughtfully on her cereal. "A little. But I think I'd rather have two happy parents in different houses than two unhappy parents in the same house." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're pretty smart, you know that?" "I get it from my dad," she said, and smiled. That night, after Ellie had gone to bed, I sat in my home office and reviewed the events of the day. Rachel and Rick were both unemployed, their affair was public knowledge, and their professional reputations were in ruins. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of the first act. Rachel wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She was proud, stubborn, and resourceful, and she'd had several hours to process what had happened and plan her response. I had a feeling she wasn't finished with me yet. But then again, I wasn't finished with her either. Friday night brought the kind of spring storm that turned suburban streets into rivers and made smart people stay indoors. I was in my home office, reviewing the Peterson account files and listening to rain hammer against the windows, when the doorbell rang. It was almost 10 o'clock. Ellie had been asleep for hours, and I wasn't expecting visitors. I looked through the front window and saw Rachel's car in the driveway, engine running, headlights cutting through the rain. She was standing on the front porch, soaked to the skin despite the short walk from her car. Her hair was plastered to her head, and her makeup had run in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked like a woman who'd reached the end of her rope and decided to use it as a weapon. "We need to talk," she said when I opened the door. "It's late, Rachel. Ellie's sleeping." "Then let's talk quietly." I stepped aside and let her in, watching as she dripped rainwater onto the hardwood floor we'd refinished together 3 summers ago. She looked around the living room like she was seeing it for the first time. The furniture we'd chosen together, the family photos on the mantel, the life we'd built that was now falling apart. "You destroyed everything," she said finally. "I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped pretending I didn't see what was right in front of me." She turned to face me, her eyes bright with anger, and something that might have been desperation. "You cost me my job, my reputation, my future. Rick's wife filed for divorce and she's demanding half of everything, including money he doesn't have because you got him fired too. Rick cost himself his job when he decided to steal from the company and lie on expense reports. You cost yourself your job when you decided to help him. We weren't stealing. Hotel rooms for personal use charged to client accounts? Fake business trips to cover romantic getaways? What would you call it?" Rachel opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. We both knew what they'd been doing, and we both knew it was indefensible. "You could have just asked for a divorce," she said quietly. "We could have handled this like adults." Adults don't lie to their spouses for months while carrying on affairs with their co-workers. Adults don't treat their families like inconvenient obstacles to their happiness. "So you decided to play judge and jury instead?" I walked to the window and looked out at the storm. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by thunder that shook the house. I decided to stop being a victim. By making me one? By making you face consequences. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing behind me, quick and shallow like she'd been running. When she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, more vulnerable. "I never meant for it to happen this way," she said. "With Rick, I mean. It just happened." "Things don't just happen, Rachel. People make choices." "You're right. I made choices. Bad choices. But Damon, we were married for 15 years. Doesn't that count for something?" I turned to look at her. She'd found a towel somewhere and was trying to dry her hair, the motion automatic and familiar. How many times had I watched her do exactly that after getting caught in the rain? "It counted for everything," I said. "That's why this hurts so much." "Then let's fix it. We can go to counseling, work through this, find a way back to each other." There is no way back, Rachel. You made sure of that when you decided I was too stupid to notice what you were doing. Her face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the woman I'd married instead of the stranger she'd become. I never thought you were stupid. Yes, you did. You thought I was the boring husband who fixed computers and mowed the lawn and never asked difficult questions. You thought I'd never figure out that your late nights weren't about work and your business trips weren't about clients. Damon, you thought I was safe, predictable, someone you could lie to without consequences. The front door opened, and we both turned toward the sound. Rick Latham stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his expensive suit, his hair plastered to his skull. He looked like a man who'd lost everything and decided he had nothing left to lose. "Rick," Rachel said, her voice sharp with warning. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," he replied, stepping into the house and closing the door behind him. "But here we are." I moved between Rick and the staircase that led to Ellie's bedroom. "You need to leave. Both of you." "I need to talk to you," Rick said, his voice slurred slightly with alcohol. "Man to man. We don't have anything to talk about." "We have everything to talk about." Rick pulled out his phone and held it up like a weapon. "You think you're so smart, so clever. You think you destroyed my life without leaving any fingerprints. I think you destroyed your own life by making terrible decisions." "Funny thing about terrible decisions," Rick said, swaying slightly. "Sometimes they leave evidence behind." He tapped his phone screen, and suddenly my voice filled the living room, tinny and distorted, but unmistakably mine. Rick's professional reputation was now under scrutiny. His expensive car had been humiliated. In a public parking lot, I felt my stomach drop. He was playing a recording of me talking to Jake Morrison in the parking lot of Flanagan's, discussing our plans to vandalize his car. "You recorded me?" "I've been recording everyone lately. Paranoid habit I picked up when my wife started acting suspicious." Rick grinned, but there was no humor in it. "Turns out paranoia pays off sometimes." Rachel was staring at both of us like we'd lost our minds. "You vandalized his car?" "Among other things," Rick said. "Your husband's been very busy. Haven't you, Damon?" I kept my voice steady, professional. "I don't know what you think you have, but I have evidence of criminal mischief, harassment, and conspiracy. I have recordings of you planning to destroy my property and ruin my reputation." Rick's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. "I have enough to file charges and sue you for everything you own. And what do you want in exchange for not doing that? I want my job back. I want a letter of recommendation. And I want $50,000 for the inconvenience you've caused me." I almost laughed. "You want me to pay you for having an affair with my wife?" "I want you to pay me for illegally interfering with my life and career." "Rick," Rachel said, her voice tight with fear, "this isn't what we discussed." "What you discussed?" I looked. Between them, pieces clicking into place. "This was planned. You came here together." "Rachel thought she could talk sense into you," Rick said. "I told her you were too arrogant to listen to reason. So you decided to try blackmail instead. I decided to try justice." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with irony. Rick Latham, who'd stolen from his employer and cheated on his wife, was talking about justice. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough to rattle the windows. The power flickered, but held, and in the brief darkness, I made my decision. "You want to talk about justice?" I said, pulling out my own phone. "Let's talk about justice." I opened the voice recording app and hit play. Rick's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "The Peterson account has been a gold mine. All those fake business trips, all those hotel rooms charged to the company. Rachel's been helping me pad the expenses for months." Rick's face went white. "That's not... I never said that." "You said it last Tuesday night at Flanagan's. You were drunk, bragging to some woman at the bar about how clever you were." I paused the recording. "You want to compare evidence? Let's compare evidence." Rachel was backing toward the door. "I'm leaving." "This is insane," No, Rick said, grabbing her arm. You're not going anywhere. We're in this together. Let go of me. You helped me with those expense reports. If I go down, you go down with me. I already went down, Rachel snapped, pulling free from his grip. I lost my job, remember? And now you're going to help me get mine back. By blackmailing my husband? By threatening the father of my child? Something in Rachel's voice had changed. The desperation was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more dangerous. Your husband destroyed both our lives, Rick said. He owes us. He owes us nothing. Rachel turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in months. Respect. He caught us. He outplayed us. He won. Rachel, you want $50,000? Get it from your wife's divorce settlement. Oh, wait. She's taking everything because you're an adulterous liar who steals from his employer. Rick's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. You think you're better than me? You were right there in those hotel rooms. You signed off on those expense reports. Yes, I did, and I lost everything because of it. But I'm not going to compound my mistakes by threatening innocent people. Innocent? Rick laughed bitterly. Your husband orchestrated this whole thing. He's been manipulating us for weeks. He's been revealing who we really are, Rachel said quietly. There's a difference. Rick stared at her for a long moment, then pulled out his phone again. Fine. If you won't help me, I'll handle this myself. He started dialing, presumably calling the police to report my crimes. I could have stopped him, could have pointed out that his own recorded confessions would make any criminal complaint complicated, at best. Instead, I walked to the front door and opened it. Get out, I said. I'm not going anywhere until... Get out of my house or I'll call the police myself and let them sort through all our evidence together. Rick looked at me, then at Rachel, then at his phone. The calculation was visible on his face, weighing the strength of his position against the potential consequences of escalating the situation. Finally, he put his phone away. This isn't over, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, it is, I replied. It's been over since the moment you decided to steal from your employer and lie to your wife. Rick walked to the door, then turned back one last time. You think you're so righteous, so justified. But you're just as manipulative as anyone else. Maybe. But I'm manipulative in service of the truth. You were manipulative in service of lies. He left without another word, walking out into the storm like a man with nowhere to go. Rachel and I stood in the sudden quiet of the living room, listening to the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. She was still holding the towel, still dripping onto the hardwood floor. He's right about one thing, she said finally. You did orchestrate this. Yes, I did. It was brilliant, ruthless, but brilliant. Thank you. She smiled, and for a moment it was the smile I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. I always underestimated you. I know. That was my biggest mistake, wasn't it? Not the affair, not the lies, but thinking you were someone I could fool indefinitely. That was one of your mistakes. Rachel nodded and walked toward the door. I'll come by this weekend to get the rest of my things, when Ellie's not here. That's probably best. She paused with her hand on the doorknob. For what it's worth, I am sorry. About all of it. I know you are. Will you ever forgive me? I thought about that for a moment, looking at the woman who'd shared my life for 15 years, who'd given me a daughter, who'd broken my heart so thoroughly that I'd had to rebuild myself from scratch just to function. I don't know, I said honestly, but I hope someday I can. She nodded and opened the door. Take care of Ellie. Always. Rachel walked out into the storm, and I watched her drive away through the rain-streaked window. Her taillights disappeared around the corner, and I realized I might never see her again. The thought should have made me sad. Instead, it made me feel free. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went upstairs to check on Ellie. She was sleeping peacefully, her room lit by the soft glow of her nightlight, her breathing steady and calm. Tomorrow, I would have to explain why Mommy wasn't coming home anymore. I would have to help my daughter navigate the complicated emotions of divorce and abandonment, and the way families sometimes fell apart, despite everyone's best intentions. But tonight, I just stood in her doorway and listened to the storm pass over our house, washing the air clean and leaving everything fresh and new. In the morning, the sun would shine, and we would begin again,